There is a particular kind of guilt that doesn't arrive when you've done something wrong. It arrives when you've finally stopped hurting, when you walk away from the chaos, set down a grief that was never entirely yours to carry, and sit in a room that is, for the first time in years, genuinely quiet. And instead of exhaling in relief, you feel like a traitor, like peace itself is the problem, like choosing yourself was a form of abandonment. This video is about that guilt, where it comes from, and why it makes more sense than you think. You were taught somewhere along the way, not in words, but in pattern, that love looks like suffering together. That devotion is measured not in warmth, but in how much you are willing to endure. That if someone you love is in pain, the only acceptable response is to carry some of that pain yourself, to hold vigil beside the wound, to never leave the burning building, even when the fire was never yours to begin with. So when the day comes that you finally take a step back, when you choose rest instead of rescue, when you stop fighting a war that was handed to you without your consent, when you begin to reach, tentatively, towards something softer, something deep inside you whispers, "You shouldn't have done that." That whisper sounds so much like conscience. It feels exactly like guilt, but it isn't guilt about something you've done wrong. It is guilt about something you've finally done right, and an old, frightened part of you doesn't yet know how to hold that distinction. Here is the myth, that choosing peace means you no longer care, that walking away from dysfunction is the same as walking away from people, that healing yourself draws something out of a shared account, a debt made visible, a balance tipping, a betrayal being quietly recorded in some invisible ledger of loyalty you didn't know you were keeping. And the myth is so deeply compelling precisely because it was not constructed from nothing. It was built from real love, real history, real people who shaped you at an age when you couldn't yet question their authority over your emotional reality. The distortion is subtle. It doesn't announce itself as distortion. It feels, instead, exactly like conscience, like the small voice of a good person who cares. But ask yourself, honestly, when did peace become something you had to justify? When did stillness become a crime that required explanation? When did choosing yourself begin to feel like a verdict on everyone else? And more importantly, who first made you feel that way? Because someone did. Someone or something wrote that equation into you. And it started long before you were old enough to ask whether it was true. Most of us did not arrive at adulthood believing that peace was dangerous. That belief was installed, quietly, over many years, often by people who loved us genuinely, fiercely, but who were themselves never given permission to rest. Perhaps you grew up in a home where calm was rare, and when it did arrive, it never lasted long enough to trust. It was always a pause between storms, a held breath before the next rupture. And so, over time, you learned not to settle into the stillness. You learned to stay alert even in quiet rooms, to monitor the emotional temperature of every space you walked into, to read the weight in a silence, to anticipate the shift before it came. Because for you, peace was never safety. It was just the moment before something broke. Or perhaps the message was more social than structural. Perhaps loyalty in your family or your community or the people who raised you was measured by your willingness to stay inside the difficulty, to remain, to endure together. And anyone who reached for ease, who wanted something softer, who dared to put distance between themselves and the suffering, was quietly labeled selfish, a deserter, someone who had forgotten where they came from, someone who thought they were better. You may have felt the echo of this in small moments you barely registered at the time. The way you started therapy and kept it secret from the people closest to you. The way you drew a boundary and then spent 3 days apologizing for it. The way you chose not to attend the gathering that always left you emotionally hollowed, and then lay awake at 2 in the morning wondering if you were a bad person, if you were cold, if something essential in you had broken. That guilt was not accidental, it was trained. It was a conditioned alarm, a deeply wired signal that said, peace is a privilege for other people, not for someone with your obligations, not for someone with your history. You belong to the struggle. And the grief inside that sentence, if you let yourself sit with it for just a moment, is almost unbearable. Because you deserved peace then too. You always did. Here is what almost no one tells you about choosing peace. It doesn't just change you. It changes the entire architecture of the system you've been living inside. When you were anxious and reactive, always emotionally available for the next eruption, you were predictable, reliable in a painful kind of way. The dysfunction had a rhythm, a familiar geography, Everyone inside it had learned their position, their cue, their line. There was the one who escalated, the one who soothed, the one who disappeared, the one who stayed and absorbed everything silently, faithfully, endlessly. You knew your role. And you played it with a kind of unconscious precision for longer than you can probably remember. But peace disrupts that geography entirely. And you become still, genuinely, quietly, unperformatively still. The people who had grown to depend on your reactivity don't always know what to do with the absence of it. When you stop absorbing other people's storms, those storms have nowhere to land. They scatter looking for a surface. And sometimes, not always, but often enough to notice, the people you love most will feel threatened by your calm. Not because they are unkind, not because they don't love you, but because, in ways that were never spoken and never signed, your suffering was part of the contract. Your availability for pain was the currency of your belonging. And this is where the guilt becomes most insidious. Because when those around you push back against your peace, when the resistance surfaces, when the accusations come, when you're told you've changed, that you've become cold, that you've abandoned something sacred, it seems to confirm the exact story you were already afraid was true, that your peace was selfish, that healing yourself cost someone something they didn't consent to lose. Think of it as this: you were a weight-bearing wall in a house that was never built to stand on its own. You held the structure upright not because it was your calling, but because you were placed there at an early age and simply never left. And when you finally, quietly, without drama or fanfare, began to step out of that position, not in anger, not in cruelty, but simply in exhaustion, the whole structure shuddered. And the house blamed the wall for leaving. It didn't occur to anyone to ask how long the wall had been holding. There is a kind of loyalty that wears the face of love. That sounds like dedication when you describe it. That feels like devotion in the moments when you enact it. But underneath, if you are honest, if you sit very quietly and press your hand against the actual feeling, it is something else. It is fear. Fear in a familiar shape. Fear dressed in the language of commitment. And you remain inside a painful dynamic, not because it nourishes you, not because it is growing into something livable, but because leaving would make you the villain of a story you've been trying to survive. You are not choosing love. You are choosing the version of yourself that others are most comfortable with. The suffering version, the always available version, the version that never inconveniences, never disappoints, never stops long enough to ask what asterisk it asterisk needs. And that version is tired in a way that sleep has never been able to touch. You may have felt it in the way your body quietly braced at certain phone numbers appearing on your screen, the way your chest tightened almost imperceptibly before certain conversations even began, the way you rehearsed your words in advance, tried to anticipate every possible reaction, managed every edge of the interaction, and then spent hours afterward dissecting what went wrong, all without anyone ever pausing to ask how you asterisk were doing. That is not love, that is labor. Invisible, unacknowledged, unceasing emotional labor performed in the background of your daily life that leaves you hollow in a way you can barely name because no one has ever named it for you. You gave until giving felt like your only mode of existing, and then you gave more. And still, somehow, you felt guilty that it wasn't enough. The well cannot keep offering water when no rain has touched it in years. And here is the cruelty at the heart of this. The very people who drain the well are often the ones who call you selfish for putting a fence around it, who frame your rest as rejection, who experience your boundary as punishment, who translate your healing into evidence of their abandonment. The cost of loyal suffering is not just your peace. It is yourself, slowly, quietly, the way a coastline erodes, not all at once, but grain by grain, storm by storm, season by season, until one day you look down and realize you are standing at the edge of something that used to be solid ground. And you don't remember when it started crumbling. Let's sit with something for a moment, something that may feel uncomfortable at first, but stay with it. When you choose peace, when you step back from the storm, when you allow yourself to be quiet without justifying the quiet, when you stop performing anguish as a substitute for connection, you are not betraying the people you love. You are betraying a asterisk role asterisk. And that distinction is not a small one, it is everything. The role of the martyr, the fixer, the absorber, the one who stays, the one who holds everyone else's emotional weight before attending to their own. That role was never your truest self, it was armor, fitted to you at an age when you had no say in the fitting, worn for so many seasons that it began to feel indistinguishable from skin. And when you begin to remove it slowly, carefully, as you would anything that had been fused to you, it hurts in a way that feels like loss, because it is loss. The loss of a familiar shape, a recognized identity, a way of belonging that, as painful as it was at least known asterisk. But here is what peace actually is, beneath all the fear of it. It is not indifference, it is not detachment, it is not the silence of someone who has stopped caring. Peace is the quiet, radical insistence that you are equally worthy of gentleness, not more worthy than the people you love, but equally, finally, tenderly, without the need to justify that equality with sacrifice. You can love deeply and still choose peace. Those two things were never opposites. They only felt that way because the people who shaped you needed them to be opposites, because they needed your suffering to validate their connection to you. You may still grieve the relationships that couldn't survive your healing. That grief is real. It deserves space and tears and time. It does not need to be reframed into something prettier than it is. But grief and guilt are not the same emotion. Grief is the natural cost of love moving through change. Guilt is a story, a very old, very convincing, very well-rehearsed story. And you are allowed, slowly, on your own timeline, without anyone's permission, to stop believing it.